Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, right? You walk in broken, hurting, dying even, and they're supposed to fix you. That's what I thought too, until I started working the night shift at Mercy Pines General. It was my first night as a security guard there. The hospital had been struggling to hire, and I needed the money. I figured it'd be boring, walking the same sterile hallways, sipping bad coffee, and checking empty rooms. I never expected what happened that night. The shift began with the usual briefing from the daytime guard. "Look, Jacob," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't go near the south wing after midnight." I thought he was messing with me, just trying to haze the new guy. I laughed it off. "Why? What's so special about the south wing?" The man didn't smile. "It's just, things happen there at night. Doors that shouldn't open. Sounds. Lights flickering. You'll see." His words stayed with me, even as I made my rounds. First, everything was quiet. The ER buzzed with the usual chaos, nurses running between beds, patients groaning, the PA system crackling with calls for doctors. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the energy in the building seemed to shift. The fluorescent lights flickered, humming louder than before. The hallways felt colder. Empty rooms didn't feel empty. By 11:45, I was standing at the entrance to the south wing. It was roped off with a sign that read, "Under maintenance." But something about it felt wrong. The air was thick, like it was harder to breathe there. I stood there, staring down the darkened corridor. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Click, click, click. It echoed through the empty wing, like someone tapping their nails against a metal surface. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the eerie silence. No answer. I radioed the main desk. "Hey, is anyone supposed to be in the south wing?" A pause. Then, "No one's been assigned there for weeks. It's closed off." "Why?" I didn't answer. The clicking grew louder, faster, like it was coming toward me. My heart raced as I unhooked the flashlight from my belt and shone it into the hallway. It illuminated nothing, just the empty corridor stretching ahead, lined with gurneys and patient rooms that hadn't been used in months. But the clicking didn't stop. It was just ahead of me now, so close I should have been able to see its source. Yet the hallway was still empty. Then the lights in the entire wing went out. The darkness in the south wing wasn't normal. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt alive, pressing against my skin, sinking into my chest. I couldn't see my own hands in front of me. The clicking sound stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. My breath sounded too loud, too fast. I fumbled for my radio, gripping it tightly as I whispered, "South wing lights just went out. Can someone check the breakers?" Static answered me. A harsh crackle, then nothing. "Hello?" I tried again. "Can anyone hear me?" Silence. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, shaky and weak. I aimed it at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Everything looked the same as before. The sterile white tiles, the gurneys, the closed doors. But something about the hallway had shifted. The air felt heavier. The shadows at the edge of the light seemed thicker, darker. Then the sound came back. Click, click, click. It wasn't coming from in front of me anymore. It was behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam swept the hallway, but it was empty, just the way I'd come. "Is anyone there?" I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice wavered. Click, click, click. It was closer now, slow and deliberate. My gut twisted as I backed away, inching deeper into the hallway. My feet brushed against something, a wheelchair left abandoned against the wall. It rolled slightly, the movement echoing in the silence. "Come on," I whispered to myself. "It's just your mind playing tricks." I was about to turn around when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just on the edge of my flashlight's range, a shadow moved. It was subtle, like something slipping out of view the second I aimed at it. I strained my eyes, holding the light steady, but nothing was there. Click, click. The sound was louder now, unmistakable. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like nails tapping on a hard surface. Then, The hallway's intercom crackled to life, its static making me jump. A distorted voice whispered through the speakers, faint but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Room 209. My mouth went dry. Room 209 was halfway down the south wing, right in the heart of the darkness. I tried the radio again. Who's on the intercom? Who's playing around? No response. I was about to turn and leave. Screw the job, screw the wing. But then I heard something that froze me in place. A low groan, coming from one of the rooms ahead. It was faint, weak, like someone in pain. I should have walked away. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run back to the lit parts of the hospital and pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But I couldn't ignore it. If someone needed help, I had to check. So I walked toward the sound. Each step echoed against the walls, louder than it should have been. My flashlight swept from door to door, the numbers painted neatly above each frame. The groaning grew louder, more desperate. I reached room 209 and hesitated. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out into the hallway. My hand shook as I pushed the door open. "Hello!" My voice cracked. The flashlight beam cut through the room, landing on an empty hospital bed. The sheets were clean, untouched, the equipment unplugged. It looked like the room hadn't been used in months. But the groaning continued, coming from the corner of the room where the light didn't reach. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The groaning stopped. Then something whispered back. "You shouldn't have come." The whisper sent an icy jolt through my body. My flashlight wavered as I aimed it at the corner of the room. There was nothing there, just empty space, shadows clinging to the walls like thick smoke. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice breaking despite my attempt to sound tough. No answer. I took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath my weight. The shadows in the corner seemed to ripple, almost as if they were alive. My stomach churned, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. And then it moved. The darkness slithered upward, stretching, twisting, forming into something humanoid but wrong. Its outline was jagged, its edges shifting as though it wasn't confined to the rules of reality. A faint light glinted where its eyes should have been, two pinpricks of malevolence that locked onto me. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, but this time the voice was louder, deeper, as if spoken by a chorus of mouths. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking violently in my hands. The beam flickered, struggling to stay on, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. What are you?" My voice was barely above a whisper. The thing tilted its head, the motion unnatural, like a puppet on strings. It didn't answer. Instead, it began to move toward me, its body gliding more than walking. With each step, the air in the room grew colder, pressing against me like invisible hands. I backed away, my legs trembling, but the door to the hallway seemed impossibly far now. "Stay back," I shouted, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The beam hit the thing directly, but instead of retreating, it only seemed to grow larger, feeding off the light. The shadows stretched across the walls, swallowing the room in a suffocating blackness. My breath hitched as I felt something brush against my arm. Cold, wet, and fleeting. I turned, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. "You don't belong here," the voices hissed. "Leave while you still can." "I'm trying," I yelled, my voice cracking. Then the groaning returned, louder this time, echoing from all around me. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping in agony. It sounded like they were trapped, begging for release. I turned toward the door, my flight instincts finally taking over. But as I reached it, the shadow was there, blocking my way. Its form twisted and expanded, filling the entire doorway. "You can't leave," it growled. My flashlight sputtered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. "Please," I whispered, my back against the cold wall. My mind raced, grasping for any kind of plan, any kind of escape. Then I remembered the radio. With shaking hands, I fumbled for it and pressed the button. "Help! Someone get to the south wing. I'm trapped in room 209. Please. For a moment, nothing but static filled the line. Then a voice broke through. Calm, deliberate, and chilling. You shouldn't have gone there, Jacob. The shadow lunged. The shadow's sudden movement sent me into a blind panic. I dove to the side, crashing into the metal stand of an 4-pole as the thing lunged at where I'd just been. The pole clattered to the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, and darted toward the far side of the room. The dim emergency light outside the window barely illuminated anything, but it was enough to see that the shadow was reforming, stretching upward again. You can't run, it hissed, the voice curling around me like smoke. I yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway. My boots pounded against the tiles, the sound echoing through the south wing. My flashlight was useless now, its beam dead, but I didn't dare stop to figure out why. Behind me, the shadow followed, moving with an unnatural speed. It didn't run. It didn't need to. It flowed like liquid, slipping along the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Every time I glanced back, it was closer. The hall stretched endlessly in front of me, but I kept running. My lungs burned. My legs screamed for rest, but the thought of what that thing would do if it caught me kept me going. The clicking noise returned, sharp, deliberate, and right in my ear. I stumbled, my shoulder slamming into the wall, and I spun around. The shadow was mere feet away now, its shifting form blocking the entire hallway. Those pinprick eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I froze. Then something unexpected happened. The lights in the south wing flickered back on. The sudden brightness made me wince, but it also revealed something new. The shadow wasn't just a shadow. It was filled with faces, dozens of them, shifting and writhing beneath its surface, their mouths open in silent screams. I staggered back, my stomach turning at the sight. The faces weren't random, they were people. Patients, doctors, nurses. Some of them looked recent, others like they'd been trapped in there for decades. Help us. One of the faces whispered, its voice faint and desperate. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing. The shadow surged forward, forcing me to sprint down the hallway again. I turned a corner, almost slipping on the tiles, and spotted the elevator at the far end. Come on, I muttered, pushing myself harder. The shadow roared behind me, a sound like metal grinding against metal, and I felt the temperature drop again. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the walls and floor. I reached the elevator and slammed my hand against the call button. The doors slid open with agonizing slowness, but as soon as they were wide enough, I dove inside and hit the close door button repeatedly. The shadow rounded the corner just as the doors began to shut. For a heart-stopping second, I thought it would slip through the gap, but the doors sealed just in time. The elevator jolted as it began to ascend. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe yet. The small interior of the elevator felt suffocating. I glanced at the buttons, watching the numbers climb. 2, 3, then the elevator stopped. The lights flickered again, and the temperature plummeted. No, I whispered, slamming my fist against the control panel. No, no, no. The lights went out, plunging the elevator into darkness. And then, from behind me, the whisper came again. You can't escape, Jacob. The whisper sent a shiver down my spine so sharp it felt like ice stabbing my nerves. My back was pressed against the cold metal wall of the elevator, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wasn't alone anymore. In the darkness, I could feel it. Something was in the elevator with me. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. I fumbled for my flashlight, smacking it against my palm in a desperate attempt to bring it back to life. Click. The beam flickered on, casting a weak, jittery light around the elevator. It landed on the control panel first. The floor numbers were wrong. 1, B1, B2, B3. The elevator wasn't going up anymore. It was descending past floors that didn't exist. I swung the flashlight toward the other side of the elevator, and there it was. The shadow filled the space, its form towering and distorted, the faces writhing beneath its surface more vivid than before. Their mouths opened and closed in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't the faces that held my attention. It was the hands. They were pressing outward from the shadow's shifting surface, clawing at the air as if trying to escape. Long, skeletal fingers reached toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back, hitting the control panel with my shoulder. "Stop!" I screamed, slamming my fist against the emergency stop button. The elevator jolted, screeching to a halt. But the shadow didn't stop. It moved closer, its edges curling and stretching as if it were testing the limits of the small space. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The faces in the shadow all turned toward me at once. Their mouths moved in unison, and the voices that came out weren't a whisper anymore. They were a chorus of screams. "We are trapped." The sound was deafening, like nails on a chalkboard amplified 1,000 times. I dropped the flashlight, covering my ears, but the sound drilled into my skull. The elevator lights flickered back on, bright and blinding, and for a split second, I saw something behind the shadow. A door. It wasn't the elevator doors, it was different. Rusted metal, with strange symbols etched into its surface. It looked ancient, out of place, like it didn't belong in the hospital or even this world. The shadow moved toward the door, as if drawn to it. The faces in its form contorted, their expressions shifting from terror to rage. "Open it!" the shadow growled, its voice a guttural snarl that made my stomach churn. "What?" I stammered, backing into the corner of the elevator. "Open the door," it repeated, its form pulsating with an unnatural energy. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay away from that door. But the shadow loomed closer, its skeletal hands reaching for me, and I knew I didn't have a choice. Trembling, I stepped forward and placed my hands on the cold, rusted metal. The symbols carved into the door glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. "Do it," the shadow hissed. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed. The door creaked open, revealing a swirling void of darkness beyond. It wasn't like the shadow. It was deeper, emptier, as if it led to a place where light and sound didn't exist. The shadow began to flow toward the void, its form unraveling as it crossed the threshold. The faces screamed, their voices mingling into a cacophony of fear and desperation. "No!" they cried. "Don't let us go back." I staggered away from the door, my heart pounding as the last of the shadow disappeared into the void. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the elevator jolted back to life. The lights steadied, the temperature rose, and the floor numbers returned to normal. Ding! The elevator doors slid open, revealing the brightly lit lobby of the hospital. I stepped out, my legs shaking, and turned back to look at the elevator. The doors were already closing, and as they did, I saw a faint shadow flicker across the metal surface. It was gone, but I wasn't sure if it was truly over. The cold air of the hospital lobby hit me like a slap, but it wasn't comforting. It felt wrong. Too sterile, too quiet. I staggered out of the elevator, barely able to keep my balance. My mind raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as I scanned the space. It was empty. No nurses at the front desk. No patients waiting in chairs. Not even the usual hum of conversation or the distant clatter of medical equipment. The silence was deafening. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. No answer. I moved toward the desk, my footsteps unnaturally loud. My hands shook as I picked up the phone, trying to call security, but the line was dead. Even the emergency lights on the phones were out. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. It wasn't ticking. The hands were frozen at 12:15. I glanced at my watch. Same time, unmoving. "Come on," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. "It's just a power glitch or something. That's all." But I didn't believe it. I turned toward the main entrance, the automatic glass doors standing still. Beyond them, the parking lot was bathed in darkness. No streetlights, no headlights, just an empty void stretching out into the night. As I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't just dark outside. It was wrong. The world beyond the hospital looked smudged, like a watercolor painting someone had started to erase. Shapes twisted and blurred, refusing to form anything recognizable. Jacob! The sound of my name sent a jolt through me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, standing in the middle of the lobby, was a nurse. At least, I think it was a nurse. Her uniform was outdated, yellowed with age, and her hair was pinned up in a style I'd only ever seen in black and white photos. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wrong. Empty, like staring into twin pools of ink. "Jacob," she said again, her voice soft but commanding. "You shouldn't have opened the door." My throat tightened. Who are you?" The nurse tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You let it out." "What are you talking about?" I snapped, the panic rising in my chest. I was just trying to survive?" She interrupted, her voice cutting through me like a knife. "You've made it worse. For all of us." I shook my head, stumbling back. "No, that thing, it's gone. I saw it disappear." The nurse took a step toward me, her movements slow, deliberate. "You saw it leave this place, but it didn't leave you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand, pointing at something behind me. I turned, my stomach sinking. The reflection in the glass doors wasn't mine. It was the shadow. Its distorted, shifting form stood where I should have been, its eyes glowing faintly in the mirrored surface. The faces within it moved sluggishly, their mouths forming silent screams. I whipped around, but nothing was there. The space behind me was empty. "It's with you now," the nurse said, her voice trembling slightly. "It will follow you, feed on you. And when it's done..." She trailed off, her figure beginning to fade, her features dissolving like smoke in the air. "No!" I shouted, reaching for her. "What do I do? How do I stop it?" But she was already gone, leaving me alone in the empty, frozen hospital. I staggered back, my chest heaving as the weight of her words sank in. The shadow wasn't gone. It wasn't trapped in that void. It was inside me. I turned back toward the elevator, its doors sealed shut, and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The lobby felt smaller, darker, as if the walls were inching closer with every breath I took. The nurse's words echoed in my mind. "It's with you now. It will follow you, feed on you." I didn't want to believe it, but the reflection in the glass had been clear. It wasn't me. The shadow, that thing, was inside me, hiding just beneath the surface. I stumbled toward the staff break room, my legs barely holding me up. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows across the tiled floor. I splashed cold water on my face in the small sink, hoping to jolt myself out of this waking nightmare. But when I looked up at the mirror, my heart stopped. My reflection was smiling. It wasn't a natural smile. It was too wide, too strained, like someone had forced my face into a grotesque mask of cheer. My eyes, though, were the worst part. They were pitch black, pools of ink staring back at me. "No," I whispered, gripping the edges of the sink. "This isn't real." The reflection tilted its head, mimicking the nurse from earlier. Its smile widened further, splitting my lips unnaturally. I raised a trembling hand to my mouth, but my reflection didn't follow. It spoke, its voice distorted, layered with dozens of others. "Let us out, Jacob." I stumbled back, knocking over a chair as the reflection reached toward me, out of the mirror. Its hand stretched through the glass, rippling like water as it clawed for my chest. "No!" I screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a coffee pot, and smashing it against the mirror. The glass shattered, pieces scattering across the counter and floor. The distorted hand vanished, leaving only jagged shards reflecting my terrified face. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint and chilling, coming from behind me. We're still here. I spun around, clutching the broken coffee pot's handle like a weapon. The room was empty, but the shadows on the walls moved, writhing like living things. "Get out of my head!" I shouted, backing toward the door. The shadows didn't stop. They slid along the walls, pooling together in the corner until they formed a familiar shape, the towering figure of the shadow, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You open the door," it said, its voice like gravel scraping against metal. "Now you will pay the price." I bolted out of the break room, my heart pounding. The hospital wasn't right anymore. The hallways stretched endlessly, looping back on themselves. The lights flickered erratically, casting eerie, twisting shapes that danced at the edges of my vision. "Help!" I yelled, but my voice echoed back to me, distorted and mocking. I reached the emergency exit and shoved it open, stumbling into the stairwell. The air was freezing, each breath a visible puff in the dim light. I started down the stairs, but the clicking sound returned. Faint at first, then louder, faster, echoing from all around me. Click, click, click. It wasn't just one source. It was everywhere. I gripped the railing, descending faster, my footsteps slamming against the metal stairs. The sound grew closer, and I knew it was following me. The stairwell twisted impossibly, the steps spiraling downward endlessly. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. The clicking was right behind me now, accompanied by faint whispers. "You can't escape. You're ours now." The steps gave way beneath me, and I fell, tumbling into the void below. The sensation of falling seemed to last forever, my screams swallowed by the darkness. When I hit the ground, there was no pain, just cold, unbearable cold. I opened my eyes, and I was back in the hospital lobby. The lights were steady, the clock ticking normally, the faint hum of activity echoing from the ER. It looked normal, but I wasn't. I glanced at the glass doors, dreading what I might see. My reflection stood there, smiling again, its black eyes glinting with malice. "You'll never be alone again, Jacob," it whispered, though its lips didn't move. I backed away, trembling, and felt something cold brush against my shoulder. When I turned, there was nothing there, but I knew better now. The shadow wasn't gone. It was waiting, and it was patient. I didn't leave the hospital that night. Part of me wanted to sprint into the night and never look back. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had attached itself to me wasn't confined to Mercy Pines General. It was a part of me now. Running wouldn't change that, so I stayed. The rest of my shift passed in a haze, my body moving on autopilot while my mind struggled to process what had happened. I avoided mirrors, reflective surfaces, even the windows. The faces in the shadow haunted me, their cries, their pleading eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were people like me, ordinary souls who had been caught in something far bigger, far darker than they could comprehend. When the dawn finally came, I walked out of the hospital into the pale morning light. The parking lot was filled with cars now, the world outside sharp and clear, not the smudged, surreal void it had been. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But the moment I got into my car and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, I knew it wasn't. My face stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. The edges of my reflection rippled, and for a fraction of a second, I saw the shadow there, just beneath the surface. It grinned at me with teeth far too sharp. I slammed the mirror upward, refusing to look anymore. The weeks that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the shadow's presence, looming just out of sight. I quit my job at the hospital, but it didn't help. The thing was with me everywhere. Lights flickered when I walked into rooms. My reflection moved when I didn't. I heard whispers in the silence, faint clicks in the still of the night. I tried to ignore it, to pretend I was imagining things, but the truth became impossible to deny. It wasn't just following me, it was feeding on me. My energy drained faster each day. My skin grew pale, my eyes sunken, dark circles blooming beneath them. People around me noticed, asking if I was okay. But how could I explain? How could I tell them the truth without sounding insane? And then one night, it finally happened. I was sitting alone in my apartment, the TV playing softly in the background. When the lights flickered and went out, the room plunged into darkness, and I felt it. The cold, suffocating presence of the shadow. "You can't fight us," it whispered, the voices swirling around me. "You opened the door, Jacob. You let us in. And now you're ours." "No," I said, standing shakily. "You don't own me." The shadow's laughter echoed through the room, low and mocking. "You think you're still in control? You think you have a choice?" It surged toward me, enveloping the room in darkness. The faces within it writhed, their mouths opening in silent screams, their eyes begging for release. But then I realized something. The faces weren't just screaming. They were watching me, waiting, and I understood. The thing had trapped them just as it had trapped me. But maybe I could fight back. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I stepped toward the shadow. It recoiled slightly, its edges rippling with uncertainty. "You need me, don't you?" I said, my voice shaking but defiant. "You feed on fear, on despair. Without it, you're nothing." The shadow hesitated, its form faltering. The faces within it turned toward me, their expressions shifting from fear to something like hope. I stepped closer, the cold biting into my skin, but I didn't stop. "You won't control me," I said. "And if you can't control me, you can't feed on me." The shadow screamed, its form splintering, the faces within it stretching and twisting. The air filled with a deafening roar as the room seemed to collapse inward, the darkness pulling at me, threatening to swallow me whole. But I held my ground, refusing to give in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The shadow was gone. The room was silent. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The faces were gone, the whispers silenced. I wasn't sure if I truly defeated it or if it had simply moved on to its next victim. But as I sat there, bathed in the faint glow of the TV, I knew one thing for certain. I had survived. For now. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.